What if I told you that in ancient Rome, a single skilled slave could cost more than a luxury mansion, while another human being might be sold for less than a loaf of bread? The price of human lives in the Roman Empire reveals secrets about power, economics, and society that will completely change how you see the ancient world. We're diving deep into the shadowy markets of Rome where human beings were bought, sold, and traded like commodities. We'll uncover the shocking truth about what determined a slave's worth, meet the wealthy Romans who built fortunes on human misery, and discover how this brutal system shaped one of history's greatest civilizations. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the economics of Roman slavery holds keys to comprehending not just the past, but patterns that echo through history itself. Picture the bustling forum of ancient Rome at dawn. Marble columns pierce the morning mist as merchants arrange their most valuable merchandise. But these aren't silks from China or spices from India. These are human beings, each tagged with a price that reflects their skills, beauty, strength, or education. The sound of chains mingles with the haggling voices of buyers who see flesh and blood as nothing more than investment opportunities. Every one of us has wondered about the value of human dignity, about what happens when society reduces people to mere objects. In Rome, this wasn't philosophy, it was daily business. The slave markets of the Eternal City operated with the cold efficiency of modern stock exchanges, where a person's worth fluctuated based on supply, demand, and the cruel mathematics of human exploitation. The mystery we're about to unravel goes far beyond simple numbers. How did Romans justify paying a fortune for one slave while treating another as worthless? What made some enslaved people more valuable than gold itself? And how did this system of human commodification sustain the greatest empire the world had ever known? These questions lead us into the heart of Roman civilization, where behind every marble statue and grand amphitheater stood the invisible foundation of enslaved labor. The prices paid for human lives tell a story of ambition, cruelty, and economic forces that shaped everything from Roman law to the empire's eventual collapse. But to understand how human beings became the most valuable currency in Rome, we must journey back to the moment when a small Italian city-state first tasted the intoxicating power of conquest, and witness how victory in war became the fuel for the most sophisticated slave economy in ancient history. The year was 264 before Christ. Rome stood at a crossroads that would define the next 8 centuries of human history. What began as a small city-state on the banks of the Tiber River was about to embark on a series of conquests that would flood its markets with human cargo beyond anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. Marcus Claudius Marcellus surveyed the smoking ruins of Syracuse in 212 before Christ. The siege had lasted 2 years, and now the greatest Greek city in Sicily lay broken before Roman legions. But Marcellus wasn't counting gold or silver among his spoils of war. His eyes fixed on something far more valuable: thousands of Greek artisans, scholars, doctors, and engineers who would soon fill the slave markets of Rome. Each captive represented not just labor, but specialized knowledge that could command prices rivaling the annual income of wealthy Roman citizens. The transformation had been swift and merciless. In just 5 decades, Roman military machine evolved from local conflicts into systematic conquest across the Mediterranean. Every victory brought waves of enslaved prisoners whose skills, origins, and circumstances determined their market value with mathematical precision. A captured German warrior might fetch 500 denarii, enough to buy a small farm. But a Greek physician or mathematician could command 20,000 denarii or more, equivalent to the price of a grand villa in the heart of Rome. Lucius Crassus understood this economy better than any man alive. Standing in his private courtyard in 71 before Christ, surrounded by marble statues and exotic plants, he embodied the new Roman aristocracy built on slave wealth. His fortune, estimated at 200 million sestertii, dwarfed the treasury of most kingdoms. Yet Crassus knew that behind every coin lay human suffering calculated with cold precision. The slave markets operated with brutal efficiency across the empire. In Rhodes, dealers specialized in educated Greeks who could tutor Roman children or manage complex businesses. Alexandria supplied skilled craftsmen whose techniques remained family secrets for generations. Gaul provided strong laborers for construction projects that would stand for millennia. But the crown jewel of this human trafficking network was Rome itself, where the Campus Martius hosted auctions that decided the fate of thousands weekly. Marcus Scaurus ran the most prestigious slave auction house in the capital. His establishment near the Forum attracted senators, wealthy merchants, and even emperors seeking the finest human merchandise. Scaurus possessed an almost supernatural ability to assess value in human flesh. He could spot intelligence in a frightened captive's eyes, recognize noble bearing despite chains and dirt, and calculate the profit potential of every person who crossed his auction block. The pricing system revealed the twisted logic of Roman society. Beauty commanded premium prices, especially for young women destined for wealthy households where their fates would be sealed by their master's whims. Strength mattered for gladiators and laborers, but intelligence trumped everything else. A slave who could read Greek and Latin, perform mathematical calculations, or possess specialized medical knowledge represented an investment that could appreciate in value over years. Gaius Verres, the notorious governor of Sicily, perfected the art of turning conquest into personal wealth through slave trading. His 3-year administration became legendary not for justice or efficient governance, but for the systematic conversion of free citizens into enslaved property. Verres understood that war created opportunities, and those opportunities had precise market values that could make or break fortunes overnight. The social dynamics of slave ownership created complex hierarchies within Roman households. Wealthy families might own hundreds of slaves, each assigned specific roles that reflected their market value and skills. House slaves lived vastly different lives than field workers, but all remained property that could be bought, sold, or discarded according to their owner's financial needs or personal whims. But the system's true complexity emerged in the stories of individual lives caught within this machine. Take Tiro, Cicero's secretary, whose literary skills and personal devotion eventually earned his freedom and a place in history. Or consider the thousands of nameless captives whose talents were recognized, cultivated, and monetized by masters who saw human potential as investment opportunities. The geographic scope of Roman slave trading created networks that spanned 3 continents. Merchants developed specialized knowledge of different regions, understanding that Thracian slaves excelled as gladiators. Egyptian slaves possessed agricultural expertise, and Germanic tribes produced warriors whose fierce reputation could inflate or deflate their market value depending on current political circumstances. But what nobody expected was that this carefully constructed economy of human misery would produce its own internal contradictions, creating pressures that would eventually challenge the very foundations of Roman power and reveal the true cost of building an empire on the backs of enslaved millions. The rebellion began with a single act of defiance that would shake the Roman world to its core. In 73 before Christ, Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator worth approximately 8,000 denarii in the slave markets, shattered his chains and ignited the largest slave uprising in Roman history. But this wasn't just about freedom, it was about the fundamental economics of human ownership that had made Rome wealthy beyond imagination. The gladiator schools of Capua represented the pinnacle of slave investment strategy. Lentulus Batiatus had paid premium prices for his fighting stock, investing over 2 million sestertii in a collection of warriors from across the known world. Each gladiator represented years of training, specialized diet, and medical care that transformed human beings into profitable entertainment machines. When Spartacus broke free with 78 fellow gladiators, he didn't just escape. He destroyed millions in carefully cultivated assets. What terrified Roman elites wasn't just the violence, but the economic implications. Crassus, dispatched to crush the rebellion, understood that every day Spartacus remained free, slave prices fluctuated wildly across the empire. Panic selling by nervous owners crashed markets in some regions while creating artificial scarcity in others. The rebellion revealed how deeply Roman wealth depended on the psychological acceptance of slavery by both owners and the enslaved. Marcus Crassus deployed revolutionary tactics against the slave army, but his real weapon was economic warfare. He offered massive rewards for captured rebels while simultaneously flooding certain markets with fresh slaves to stabilize prices. His strategy demonstrated how military and economic power intertwined in Roman society. Victory wasn't just about battlefield supremacy but about maintaining the financial systems that sustained civilization itself. The complexity of slave economics became apparent during the rebellion's peak. Some wealthy Romans, instead of supporting Crassus, secretly purchased slaves from rebel-controlled territories at discount prices. Others invested heavily in gladiator schools in distant provinces, betting that Spartacus would create demand for replacement fighters. War and human suffering had become commodities to be traded like grain or olive oil. But the most shocking revelation emerged from Roman government records discovered centuries later. The state itself was deeply invested in slave trading, collecting taxes on every transaction while simultaneously owning thousands of public slaves who maintained aqueducts, roads, and government buildings. Emperor Augustus would later own an estimated 20,000 slaves personally, representing wealth equivalent to the entire treasury of most kingdoms. The pricing mechanisms revealed disturbing sophistication. Slave dealers developed detailed classification systems that determined market value with scientific precision. Age, Health, education, origin, and even personality traits were quantified into mathematical formulas that predicted earning potential and resale value. A 25-year-old educated Greek might be valued at 15,000 denarii, while the same person at 35 would fetch only 8,000, regardless of accumulated knowledge or experience. Publius Vedius Pollio exemplified the extreme end of Roman slave ownership. His estate near Naples housed over 1,000 slaves whose combined value exceeded 50 million sestertii. Pollio was notorious for his cruelty, but also for his business acumen. He operated his human property like a modern corporation, with specialized departments, performance metrics, and profit optimization strategies that maximized return on investment. The geographic specialization of slave markets created international networks that rivaled modern global trade. Damascus became the hub for Asian slaves, Alexandria for Africans, and Massilia for Gauls and Germans. Merchants developed expertise in specific human commodities, understanding cultural nuances that affected pricing. Germanic slaves commanded higher prices during periods of Roman-Germanic conflict, while Greek slaves remained consistently valuable due to their educational advantages. The social implications of these economic systems reached every level of Roman society. Wealthy families competed to own the most valuable slaves as status symbols, leading to bidding wars that inflated prices beyond rational economic calculations. Owning a famous gladiator, a renowned chef, or a beautiful concubine became markers of social prestige that transcended mere financial considerations. Yet the system contained inherent contradictions that created constant tension. Educated slaves often possessed more knowledge and skills than their masters, creating psychological complexities that threatened the fundamental assumptions of Roman superiority. Some slaves accumulated personal wealth through side businesses, eventually purchasing their own freedom and becoming successful merchants who competed with their former owners. The rebellion's aftermath revealed the true fragility of slave-based economics. Crassus crucified 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, but the economic shockwaves continued for years. Insurance markets developed to protect slave owners against rebellion losses. Professional slave hunters commanded premium fees for tracking escapees. The cost of maintaining the system began approaching the profits it generated. Roman law evolved to address these economic pressures, creating increasingly complex regulations governing slave ownership, transfer, and treatment. The legal code revealed how deeply slavery penetrated every aspect of society, from inheritance laws to bankruptcy proceedings to municipal governance. Slaves weren't just property, they were the foundation of Roman legal and economic infrastructure. However, what was about to unfold would expose the ultimate paradox of Roman slave economics: how the empire's greatest strength would become its most devastating weakness, and why the very success of the slave system contained the seeds of its own destruction and the transformation of the ancient world forever. The moment of truth arrived in 376 after Christ, when Emperor Valens faced a crisis that would expose the fatal flaw in Rome's slave-based economy. Gothic tribes, fleeing the Huns, offered themselves as military allies in exchange for land. But Roman administrators saw something else entirely: hundreds of thousands of potential slaves worth billions of sestertii. Their decision to exploit rather than integrate these desperate people would trigger the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 after Christ became more than a military disaster. It was the moment when Rome's slave economy devoured itself. Emperor Valens died alongside two-thirds of his army, but the real catastrophe was economic. The Gothic victory demonstrated that Rome's military superiority, built on slave labor and financed by slave profits, could no longer sustain itself against enemies who fought for freedom rather than coin. What Roman historians couldn't comprehend was how their economic system had created its own nemesis. For centuries, Rome had enslaved Germanic tribes, selling their strongest warriors while leaving behind populations that grew increasingly desperate and militarized. The empire had essentially trained and motivated its own destroyers, creating a demographic time bomb that would explode across the frontiers. The mathematics of destruction were staggering. Roman records show that by 400 after Christ, maintaining the slave system consumed nearly 40% of imperial resources. Military campaigns to capture slaves, fortifications to prevent rebellions, administrative costs to manage human property, and the massive security apparatus required to maintain order had transformed the most profitable enterprise in ancient history into an economic burden that was slowly strangling the empire. Salvianus of Marseilles, writing in 440 after Christ, provided the most damning analysis of Roman slave economics ever recorded. His calculations showed that free Germanic settlements produced more wealth, innovation, and military strength than equivalent Roman territories dependent on slave labor. The barbarians weren't destroying civilization. They were demonstrating a more efficient economic model. The final revelation came from the most unexpected source. St. Augustine, in his masterwork, City of God, analyzed the economic data available to church authorities and reached a startling conclusion. The Christian Roman Empire was spending more money controlling slaves than those slaves were producing in value. The system had become a massive wealth destruction machine that was consuming the empire from within. Archaeological evidence from the 5th century reveals the scope of this collapse. Slave quarters in Roman villas were abandoned not because of barbarian invasions, but because owners could no longer afford to maintain their human property. The infrastructure of slavery, the markets, the chains, the guards, the administrative systems, required more resources than the labor it controlled could generate. The pricing data tells the complete story. In 200 after Christ, a skilled slave cost 20,000 denarii and could generate 30,000 denarii in lifetime value. By 400 after Christ, the same slave cost 35,000 denarii to purchase and maintain but produced only 25,000 denarii in economic value. The mathematics of human exploitation had finally turned against the exploiters. But perhaps the most shocking discovery comes from recently translated Byzantine documents that reveal the true scale of Roman slave ownership. The empire didn't just depend on millions of slaves. It had created a demographic structure where enslaved people and their descendants actually outnumbered free citizens in most provinces. Rome hadn't built an empire. It had created a prison that housed the majority of its own population. The psychological impact of this revelation was catastrophic for Roman elites. Marcus Aurelius had written philosophically about the humanity of slaves, but economic records show he personally owned over 3,000 human beings. The contradiction between Stoic philosophy and economic practice created cognitive dissonance that paralyzed Roman decision-making when the empire needed decisive action most. Germanic tribal leaders like Alaric and Attila understood something that Roman economists had missed. They weren't just military commanders. They were offering economic liberation to enslaved populations who vastly outnumbered their masters. When Rome fell, it wasn't conquered from outside but liberated from within by people who had been treated as property for generations. The final irony emerged in the empire's last decades. Roman elites, desperate to maintain their wealth, began selling their own citizens into slavery to raise funds for defense against barbarian invasions. The system that had built Roman power was now consuming Roman freedom, turning citizens into commodities in a futile attempt to preserve an unsustainable economic model. The numbers from this period are staggering in their brutality. Between 450 and 476 after Christ, Roman authorities sold an estimated 200,000 citizens into slavery to finance military campaigns. The empire was literally eating itself, converting its own population into cash to fund a war against people fighting for the right to remain free. Modern economic analysis reveals that Roman slave-based economy suffered from what economists call diminishing marginal returns on a civilization-wide scale. Each new slave required more resources to control than the previous one, while producing less value due to growing resistance, administrative costs, and the increasing militarization required to maintain the system. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable mathematical conclusion of an economic system that had violated the most basic principles of sustainable wealth creation, revealing truths about power, exploitation, and human dignity that would echo through every empire that followed. The story of Roman slave prices reveals a truth that transcends ancient history: the illusion that human exploitation can build lasting prosperity. What began as a question about market values ended as a revelation about the fundamental economics of civilization itself. We discovered that a skilled slave could indeed cost more than a mansion, reaching prices of 20,000 denarii or higher, while captured prisoners might sell for mere hundreds. But these numbers tell a deeper story than simple supply and demand. They reveal how Rome transformed human beings into the currency of empire, creating a system so sophisticated that it fooled even its creators into believing it was sustainable. The wealthy Romans we met, Crassus with his 200 million sestertii fortune, Marcus Scaurus running his prestigious auction house, Publius Vedius Pollio with his 1,000-slave estate, weren't just individual actors in this drama. They were participants in an economic experiment that would ultimately prove the impossibility of building permanent wealth on temporary suffering. The rebellion of Spartacus wasn't just about gladiators seeking freedom. It was the moment when the contradictions of slave economics first became visible to Roman society. The prices fluctuating in panic, the insurance markets developing to protect slave investments, the government's own deep involvement in human trafficking, all pointed toward a system consuming more resources than it could generate. But the most powerful revelation came in Rome's final centuries, when the mathematics of exploitation finally turned against the exploiters. The empire that had reduced millions to property ultimately reduced itself to poverty, selling its own citizens into slavery in a desperate attempt to maintain an unsustainable economic model. The archaeological evidence, the legal documents, the administrative records, they all confirm the same conclusion. Rome didn't fall to barbarian invasions. It collapsed under the weight of its own economic contradictions, destroyed by a system that promised infinite wealth through finite human suffering. These lessons resonate across history. Every society that has attempted to build prosperity through systematic human exploitation has discovered the same mathematical impossibility. Whether ancient Rome, colonial empires, or modern trafficking networks, the equation never balances. The cost of controlling human beings ultimately exceeds the value they can be forced to produce. The Gothic tribes who helped end the Western Empire understood something that Roman economists missed. Free people, fighting for their own future, create more wealth and stability than enslaved people working for someone else's profit. This wasn't just moral philosophy, it was superior economic science. Today, when we examine modern forms of exploitation, from sweatshop labor to human trafficking, we can see the same patterns Roman elites ignored. Short-term profits built on human suffering create long-term instability that destroys the very wealth they promise to generate. The prices Romans paid for human lives teach us that true prosperity can only be built on foundations that recognize the inherent worth and freedom of every individual. Because history shows that any system based on reducing people to commodities will eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. If you made it this far and aren't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe now, hit the like button, and share in the comments what surprised you most about how Romans priced human lives.